I want to talk about the relationship between postmodernism and what I guess is variously called social justice, wokeism, whatever far leftism, whatever it's known as, that's either pejorative or just descriptive, depending on where you're situated. How is what I encountered and have spoken about on this podcast a lot at Columbia, tied to the ideas of postmodernism and critical theory, and in what ways is it different?
Sure. So the thing that we refer to maybe as the social justice movement now, or critical social justice, if we follow Robin DiAngelo's very clear exposition of it in her book that she co-authored with Özlem Sensoy called Is Everyone Really Equal? What we see is actually the fusion of three lines of thought, three schools of thought. Postmodernism and critical theory we've already discussed to some degree, so we know what they are. The third is the social justice idea, which can be expressed in a number of contexts. It arose from Jesuit priests, so it arose in a religious context. It was actually probably most thoroughly developed in the earliest part of the 1900s by Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a Baptist minister who happened to also be the grandfather of Richard Rorty, the American half-postmodern philosopher. Rauschenbusch he was in Hell's Kitchen in New York City and was very interested in social welfare issues. And he came up with 6 principles. It's arguable that he found those principles when he went to London for a year or two and studied with the Fabian Society there, which was a socialist think tank of a kind, or society is the right word. I don't think they really had think tanks operating, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But anyway, he spent a couple of years with the Fabian Society, came back, and then wrote down this idea called the social gospel. Many of the ideas of social justice were already embedded within the broad idea of liberalism. The statement at the very beginning of the Constitution, the very beginning of the Declaration of Independence all point to that there's this liberalizing, equalizing notion of bringing people to levels of equality. You see it when, in particular, I loved it on the 4th of July this year. They promoted Frederick Douglass's wonderful speech, I think from 1852 or 3. Obviously, slavery was still going on, and he talks about very clearly living up to the vision of the founders of the country, very clearly living up to the Constitution, and then the hypocrisy and failures of our nation to do that by that point. Which was instrumental, I think, in the ensuing 10 years into achieving abolition. So there's this principle of social justice built into the fabric of liberal societies as well, which painfully and slowly seems to bear fruit, not always in comfortable or pretty ways, unfortunately, although I think it's arguable that we're getting better at it as time has gone on. For example, if you consider how difficult the civil rights movement was for Black Americans in the 1960s, against how, not to say it was all easy, but if you compare that against the gay movement of the 1990s, it was a much smoother ride the second time around. We have a better sense of social justice. Clearly, this was developed by liberal philosophers like John Rawls with his Veil of Ignorance thought experiment. And so we have this whole line of thought about making society more fair and more just that can be analyzed in a number of ways. One of those ways is through critical theory. So the liberationist paradigm, we saw this very clearly in the civil rights movement in the 60s, where you had the Black Power aspect up against the, I guess, Martin Luther King or universal liberal aspect in tension with one another. As the state representative from Memphis went viral on the Twitter yesterday for his speech, he was talking about being involved in the Memphis civil rights movement as a child, and when the riots would break out, he said his father would grab him by the arm and walk him away, and this is not our movement, this is not how we're going to be. We're about peace, we're about equality, we're about what did he say, civility and dignity and class. He kept saying class, we're classy. It's a very different thing than this very critical, radical, you have your power, we have our power, conflict theory approach. But you can approach the concept of social justice, which is increasing fairness and equality and decreasing discrimination and disenfranchisement in society, through critical means, if you want. So there's a critical theory school of social justice that has taken up these ideas. And then what happened, so now that's where you see the fusion of those two. And then what happened is in the 90s, they picked up those postmodern tools as a means of deconstructing the systems of power and the foundations of that which produces, maintains, and legitimizes power. So that's how they came together to form the present social justice movement that you would have experienced at Columbia, which we originally had just called applied postmodernism, but in Cynical Theories we outlined had actually reified itself by around 2010 into something very, very meta-narrative based, very rigid and doctrinal, very almost dogmatic, if not religious. And we call it reified postmodernism, which is a nerdy way to put it, but a simpler way to put it would be woke, which means generally being aware that society is constructed out of systems of power and that those are somehow maintained by language and representation and symbology and art, and that the means of cultural production in those domains have to be challenged, disrupted, dismantled, taken over, replaced by different means. And so this is really what we see happening here.
Yeah, when one groks that, that's the most cogent explanation for what we see happening. Now, that's the grounding for what we see happening and playing out all around us right now.
If you want a kind of concrete example, you can look at the origin of critical race theory specifically with Derek Bell at Harvard Law. He's credited with being the founder of critical race theory along with his student, Kimberly Crenshaw. So they together are the founders of critical race theory. Now, Derek Bell, if you read Derek Bell, and Kimberly Crenshaw, if you read Kimberly Crenshaw, have very distinct styles and approaches. And the difference is actually postmodernism. They're both very critical of liberalism. They're both, I think, very pessimistic in their analysis of liberalism, if not cynical. But nevertheless, Derek Bell was a materialist in his approach. He's very clearly interested in law. He's very clearly interested in institutions and the direct effects of law. And obviously, Kimberly Crenshaw talks about law as well with her intersectionality. You know, she's talking about this coming out of these cases, I think at General Motors, and it's possible to discriminate against Black women while not discriminating against Blacks or women as broader categories. And this is a legitimate, I mean, I think it's one of the most interesting and powerful and important discoveries in discrimination law, period.
Agreed.
But unfortunately, she went on.
Insight.
It was. And then a couple of years later, she writes this other paper mapping the margins and decides to recast the entire thing in terms of a modified version of postmodernism that takes up with Black liberationist politics, which she explicitly says this. That's what the margins are. Black liberationism pushes Black women to the margins. Radical feminism, which is a white feminist approach, pushes Black women to the margins. And so the intersectional Black feminism needs to be raised up out of the margins and mapped out. Mapping the margins is the title of the paper.
The margins.
Yeah. And so when she's discussing the failure of postmodernism, she talks about specifically that it deconstructs the idea of race. And it misses the idea that that's a very important concept. And she has this very, very clear paragraph where she says there's a fundamental difference between I am Black and I am a person who happens to be Black. And her criticism of I am a person who happens to be Black is that it forwards person in a universal sense instead of the identity group.